The Caledonia Mills disturbance. The landscape of rural Nova Scotia in the early 20th century was defined by its harshness and its silence. In the winter of 1922, the community of Caledonia Mills, located deep within Antigonish County, was not the kind of place that welcomed outsiders or solicited attention. It was a farming settlement where families worked land that was often unforgiving, relying on generations of stoicism to get through the long, dark months of snow and ice. The farms were spread far apart, separated by dense thickets of spruce and fir trees that seemed to swallow sound. It was in this isolated environment that the MacDonald family lived. Their farmhouse was a standard timber structure built to withstand the Atlantic winds, but it would soon become the center of a series of events that defied the understanding of local authorities, insurance investigators, and the family themselves. The events would eventually force them from their home, leaving the property to rot back into the earth, but for a few weeks in January, the house became the focal point of a terrifying and unexplained siege. Alexander MacDonald was the head of the household, a man respected in the community for his hard work and his no-nonsense approach to life. He lived there with his wife and their adopted daughter, Mary Ellen, who was 15 years old at the time. There was nothing remarkable about the family dynamic on the surface. They were typical of the region, hardworking, religious, and quiet. They attended Mass, they tended their livestock, and they kept to themselves. The winter of 1922 had been particularly cold, freezing the ground solid and turning the roads into treacherous ruts of ice. The isolation was absolute. It was against this backdrop of frozen stillness that the first anomalies began to occur, small incidents that were easily dismissed at first as accidents or misplacements, but would soon escalate into a phenomenon that threatened their lives. The initial activity was subtle, almost indistinguishable from the normal creaks and settling of an old wooden house in winter. Alexander began to notice that objects in the house were not where he had left them. Tools would migrate from the barn to the kitchen, utensils would disappear from the table and reappear in the hallway. At first, he blamed his own memory or perhaps the clumsiness of the others, but the movement of objects soon became too deliberate to ignore. Heavy furniture, pieces that required significant effort to lift, would be found shifted inches from their original positions. Doors that had been securely latched would be found swinging wide open, letting the biting cold air fill the heated rooms. There was a sense of unease growing in the household, a feeling that they were not alone in the space, but there was no visual evidence of an intruder. The snow around the house remained unbroken by footprints, save for their own paths to the barn and the well. The situation escalated dramatically in mid-January. The family was sitting down for their evening meal when they heard a loud thud from the upper floor. It sounded as though a heavy sack of grain had been dropped directly onto the floorboards above their heads. Alexander went upstairs to investigate, carrying a kerosene lamp to light the way. The upper floor was empty. There was nothing out of place, no fallen objects, and no sign of anyone hiding in the shadows. He checked the windows. They were all painted shut with frost and age. Confused, he returned downstairs, but before he could sit, the sound repeated, this time from the parlor. It was the sound of a heavy, dull impact. The family began to realize that the house itself was turning against them. The atmosphere in the rooms changed, becoming heavy and charged with static, a sensation that often precedes a thunderstorm, yet it was the dead of winter. The phenomenon then shifted from auditory disturbances to something far more dangerous: fire. It began with small, inexplicable ignitions. A piece of wallpaper in the hallway would suddenly begin to smolder and curl, smoke drifting up toward the ceiling. There was no source of heat nearby, no stove, no lamp, no wiring. Alexander would rush to pat it out with his hands or a damp cloth. Minutes later, a curtain in a different room would catch fire. These were not roaring blazes initially, but small, localized combustions that seemed to target flammable materials within the home. The family was forced into a state of constant vigilance. They could not sleep. They had to patrol their own home in shifts, buckets of water at the ready, watching the walls for the telltale wisp of gray smoke that signaled the start of another outbreak. News of the trouble at the McDonald farm began to leak out to the surrounding community, despite the family's desire for privacy. Neighbors who stopped by to offer help or check on the livestock were witnesses to the chaos. One neighbor reported sitting in the kitchen and watching as a dish towel hanging on a rack far from the stove suddenly burst into flame. He watched Alexander douse it, only to have a calendar on the opposite wall ignite moments later. The fires were described as having a strange quality. They did not seem to spread as naturally as a normal fire. They would flare up intensely and then die down, or they would smolder in damp areas where a fire should not have been able to catch. The sheer frequency was exhausting. In a single day, the family and their neighbors extinguished over 30 separate fires within the house. The physical toll on Alexander and his wife was immense. They were living in a smoke-filled war zone, fighting an enemy they could not see or understand. The terror was not limited to the interior of the house. The barn, the lifeline of any farm, became a target. The livestock began to exhibit signs of extreme distress. The horses would kick at their stalls, their eyes rolling in panic, soaked in sweat despite the freezing temperatures. When Alexander went to check on them, he would find their tails braided. This was not the work of wind or chance. The braids were tight, complex knots that would have taken human hands considerable time to fashion. Yet, the barn had been locked, and the snow outside remained undisturbed. The cattle were moved from one stanchion to another, a task that would require significant force and cooperation from the animals, yet it happened in the span of minutes while the family was inside the house fighting fires. The phenomenon was demonstrating a level of physical control over the environment that was terrifyingly comprehensive. As the fires continued, the local authorities had to get involved. The situation had moved beyond a domestic curiosity to a matter of public safety. Officers were dispatched to the farm to investigate. These were practical men accustomed to dealing with theft, disputes, and the harsh realities of rural life. They arrived with the assumption that this was a case of arson, likely perpetrated by someone with a grudge or perhaps a member of the family seeking attention. They began a systematic search of the property, looking for matches, chemicals, or hidden devices that could explain the sudden ignitions. They found nothing. They interviewed the family separately, looking for inconsistencies in their stories. They found none. The fear in the eyes of the McDonalds was genuine. They were people who were watching their livelihood and their sanctuary be destroyed by something they could not name. The investigators themselves became witnesses. During their stakeout of the property, officers observed the phenomena firsthand. One report details an officer standing guard in the kitchen, watching the room with a hawk's eye to catch the arsonist in the act. While he stood there with the entire family in his field of view, a fire erupted on the wall behind him. He spun around to see the wallpaper blistering and blackening. There was no one near it. The fire was put out and the wall was examined. It was cold to the touch surrounding the burn mark. There was no chemical smell, no residue of oil or gasoline. It was simply spontaneous combustion of the paper. The officers were baffled. They had arrived to make an arrest and were instead left questioning the basic laws of physics. The reports they filed were filled with hesitant language, a struggle to describe events that professional law enforcement training had not prepared them for. The focus of the investigation eventually turned toward the adopted daughter, Mary Ellen. In the lore of poltergeist phenomena, it is often a young person in the household who acts as the epicenter, and the investigators noted that the fires seemed to happen most frequently when she was present or nearby. However, this observation did not solve the mystery. It only deepened it. Even if she was the focus, the mechanics of the fires remained impossible. She was observed closely, often seated in the center of a room with her hands visible, and yet fires would start in the corners of the ceiling or in adjacent rooms. If she was causing them, she was doing so without physical contact and without any incendiary devices. The suggestion that she was responsible was floated, but the lack of evidence for how times she was doing it left the case in a state of limbo. She was not a magician, she was a farm girl with no history of pyromania or technical knowledge of delayed ignition. The psychological impact on the community was profound. The McDonald farm became a place to be avoided. The road leading to the property was shunned by locals who feared that whatever was happening there might follow them home. The darkness of the winter nights seemed to press closer to the houses in Caledonia Mills. People began to lock their doors earlier, lighting extra lamps and gathering their families close. The story of the fire spook, as it came to be called, spread throughout the province. It was covered in regional newspapers, which treated it with a mix of sensationalism and genuine alarm. Reporters who ventured to the site described a family on the brink of collapse. Alexander MacDonald, once a sturdy and confident farmer, was reduced to a shell of a man, his face gaunt from lack of sleep, his hands blackened with soot, his eyes darting to every shadow. The climax of the events came when the family could simply no longer sustain the defense of their home. The fires had become too frequent, the activity too aggressive, the house was scorched and water damaged, smelling of wet ash and fear. They made the difficult decision to abandon the property. This was not a decision made lightly. To leave the farm was to leave their livelihood, their history, and their stability. They packed what they could salvage and moved out, seeking refuge with neighbors and relatives. The house stood empty, a dark monument to the unexplained. Interestingly, once the family vacated, the intense activity within the house ceased. The fires stopped starting on their own. The sounds of heavy footsteps and crashing objects faded into the silence of the abandoned structure. It was as if the energy required the presence of the family to manifest. However, the aftermath was not a clean break. The investigation continued in a desultory fashion. Mary Ellen was eventually taken into the care of authorities and later placed in an asylum, a common and tragic solution for the time when society faced behaviors or phenomena it could not explain. She was subjected to the scrutiny of doctors and alienists who sought to find a medical or psychological reason for the events. They probed her mind, looking for hysteria or malice. While they could label her, they could never explain the physical evidence left behind at the farm. The braided tails, the burns in high corners, the moved furniture that weighed hundreds of pounds. The official explanation drifted toward a vague consensus of mischief, but the label felt hollow to anyone who had actually stood in that kitchen and watched the walls catch fire. The McDonald farmhouse remained standing for years, slowly deteriorating under the weight of the seasons. It became a local landmark of fear, a place where teenagers would dare each other to go, but few lingered. The stories of what happened there were passed down through the generations in Antigonish County. It wasn't a story of a ghost in a white sheet. It was a story of a raw, destructive force that dismantled a family's life piece by piece. The lack of a clear resolution, no fraud exposed, no natural cause identified, left a scar on the local psyche. It was a reminder that the safety of a home is an illusion, that the walls we build to keep the weather out cannot protect us from forces that seem to originate from within the very air we breathe. Researchers who have looked back at the case in later decades have often compared it to other famous poltergeist cases, noting the similarities in the rain of stones, the water manipulation, and the fires. The Caledonia Mills case stands out, however, for its rural intensity. There were no city lights to dilute the darkness, no nearby police station for quick response. The family was alone with the phenomenon in a way that modern urban victims are not. The isolation amplified the terror. When the fires started, there was no fire department to call. It was just Alexander and his bucket of water against an entity that could ignite the wood as fast as he could douse it. The survival aspect of the case is often overlooked. The family managed to survive weeks of a siege that could have easily resulted in the house burning down around them while they slept. The skepticism that usually accompanies such stories was present, of course. People in distant towns called it a hoax. They claimed Alexander did it for insurance, though he lost his home and gained nothing. They claimed Mary Ellen did it for attention, though she ended up institutionalized and outcast. These explanations, while comforting to the rational mind, failed to account for the testimony of the police officers. These were men who had no reason to lie, no reason to ruin their own reputations by filing reports about ghost fires. Their accounts remain the most disturbing element of the historical record. They provided a verified, third-party confirmation that something impossible was occurring. They did not find wires, they did not find chemical accelerants. They found a house that was attacking its inhabitants. One particular incident that stands out in the archival records involved a specific inspection by a detective from Halifax. He had arrived with the intent of exposing the fraud. He was a man of science and law, cynical by nature. He spent a night in the house, sitting in the parlor with a clear view of the hallway. He later recounted that while he was watching the empty stairs, he heard the distinct sound of someone walking down them. The tread was heavy, the wood creaking under the weight. He stood up, shining his light on the staircase. It was empty. As he watched, the sound continued past him, invisible, and then the heavy front door unlatched itself and swung open into the snowstorm. He rushed to the door. There were no footprints in the fresh snow on the porch. The detective left the next morning, his report inconclusive, his skepticism shattered by the undeniable reality of his own senses. The tragedy of the MacDonald family is that they were regular people, thrust into a narrative they did not choose. They were not occultists, they were not seeking fame, they were farmers trying to survive a winter. The events at Caledonia Mills destroyed their unit. Alexander never truly recovered from the stress of those weeks. The loss of his home and the cloud of suspicion that hung over his name took a toll on his health. The community, while initially helpful, eventually pulled away, the stigma of the haunted farm proving too strong for social bonds to withstand. It is a common pattern in these cases. The victims are victimized twice, first by the phenomenon and then by the society that cannot process the anomaly. Decades later, the site of the farmhouse has been reclaimed by nature. The trees have moved back in, the foundations have crumbled into the soil, and the physical evidence of the fires has long since rotted away. But the accounts remain in the archives of Nova Scotia folklore and in the dusty police files of the era. They serve as a testament to the fact that there are pockets of experience that defy explanation. The Caledonia Mills mystery was never solved in the traditional sense. It simply stopped when the fuel of the family was removed. It remains a disturbing example of how fragile our grip on reality can be and how quickly the familiar comforts of a home can be transformed into a landscape of absolute terror. The enduring question of the Caledonia Mills fires is not just how they started, but why. Was it an external entity? Was it a manifestation of the subconscious stress of a teenager? Or was it something geological, a magnetic or electrical anomaly of the land itself? Theories abound, but none satisfy the entirety of the facts. The wet towels that burned, the cold walls that scorched, the invisible walkers, these details refuse to fit into a neat box. The case sits in the history books as an uncomfortable silence, a gap in the rational narrative of the province. It is a story that is whispered rather than shouted, a reminder that in the deep woods of the north, in the dead of winter, there are things that burn without a match and walk without feet. Even today, those who drive through the back roads of Antigonish County might feel a shiver when passing near the old location. The geography hasn't changed. The wind still howls through the spruce trees with a voice that sounds almost human. The isolation is still there, waiting. For the McDonalds, that isolation turned into a prison. Their story is a sobering documentation of a family under siege fighting a battle against the impossible, armed only with buckets of water and prayer. It is a raw, unfiltered glimpse into a reality where the rules of physics are temporarily suspended and where the dark corners of a room can hold more than just shadows. The final aspect of the case that lingers is the silence of the aftermath. After the family left and the sensation died down, the world moved on. The 1920s roared into the 1930s, the Depression hit, and the small tragedy of a burning farmhouse was largely forgotten by the wider world. But for the people who were there, who smelled the smoke and felt the cold draft of the invisible opening doors, the memory never faded. It was a trauma etched into their minds. They had seen the veil lift just for a moment, and what they saw behind it was a chaos that had no place in their ordered lives. The MacDonald farm haunting remains one of Canada's most compelling and least understood mysteries, a cold case in the truest sense of the word, frozen in the ice of a 1922 winter, forever unresolved. The Dag Farmhouse Disturbance. The winter of 1,889 inches, the Ottawa Valley was harsh and unforgiving, a season where the cold seemed to seep through the walls of even the sturdiest homes. In the small community of Clarendon, Quebec, specifically in the Shawville area, the farmhouse of George Dag stood isolated against a landscape of snow and timber. It was a modest structure, typical for a hardworking farmer trying to support a wife, 2 young children, and an adopted girl named Dinah. For years, the rhythm of life at the Dag farm was dictated entirely by the demands of agriculture and the weather. There was nothing to suggest that this specific plot of land would soon become the center of a chaotic and terrifying series of events that would draw witnesses from across the region and leave a permanent mark on local history. The trouble did not begin with a storm or a sudden accident, but with small domestic anomalies that were easy to dismiss at first. It started in September, a time when the harvest work usually occupied every waking thought of the household. The first sign that something was wrong was purely financial, or so it seemed. George Dag found a banknote he had left on a dresser torn into pieces. It was a frustrating discovery, one he initially blamed on a mischievous child or perhaps a rodent, though the tears looked deliberate. He pieced the money back together and tried to put it out of his mind. But the atmosphere in the house began to shift rapidly after that. The air felt heavier, and the family started noticing strange stains appearing on the floorboards. It looked like red paint or blood, appearing in spots where no one had been standing. George scrubbed the floors, confused but not yet afraid. He asked his wife Susan if she had spilled anything, but she was just as baffled as he was. The stains would be cleaned away only to reappear hours later in a different pattern. It was a nuisance, a bizarre housekeeping issue that defied explanation, but it was not yet threatening. As the weeks pushed toward November, the activity escalated from passive stains to active movement. The family would be sitting at dinner when a jug of milk would slide across the table on its own. It did not tip over immediately, but moved with a steady, deliberate friction against the wood before crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering pottery became a common backdrop to their evenings. Objects that had sat on shelves for years suddenly seemed to lose their grip on gravity. A jar of pickles flew from a cupboard and smashed against a wall while the family was in the next room. Susan Dag began to fear for the safety of the children, particularly the young boy, John, and the little girl, Mary. But the activity seemed strangely focused around the presence of the 11-year-old adopted girl, Dinah. Whenever she was in a room, the air seemed charged with a static tension that preceded the movement of objects. The community of Clarendon was tight-knit, and rumors began to spread that the Dagg family was struggling with something they could not handle. George, a proud man who valued his reputation, was reluctant to ask for help. He tried to rationalize the events. He looked for loose floorboards that might cause furniture to wobble. He checked the foundation for settling that might explain the sliding objects. He looked for drafts that could knock things off shelves. But his rationalizations collapsed when the fire started. It was mid-November when the phenomenon took a dangerous turn. Smoke began to curl up from unexpected places inside the house. A window curtain burst into flames in an empty room. George rushed in to douse it with a bucket of water, his heart racing. Before he could catch his breath, he smelled smoke coming from the bedroom. A pillow on the bed was smoldering. These were not sparks from the fireplace. The fire started in the middle of fabrics, far from any heat source. Over the course of a single day, the family had to extinguish nearly 10 separate fires. They broke out in clothing, in bedding, and even in piles of paper. The terror was immediate and visceral. This was no longer a curiosity. The house itself seemed intent on consuming them. Exhausted and fearing they would burn to death in their sleep, George made the decision to evacuate the main house. He moved his family into a shed on the property, hoping that the distance would provide safety. They carried only the essentials, leaving the haunted farmhouse to stand dark and empty in the cold November night. But the reprieve was short-lived. The phenomena followed them. The shed offered no protection. As the family huddled together, stones began to rain down on the roof. It sounded like a hailstorm, but the sky was clear. Then, the stones started coming inside. They did not seem to be thrown through the door or windows in a normal trajectory. Witnesses described the stones as appearing in midair or dropping straight down from the ceiling. They were smooth river stones, some small, some large enough to cause serious injury. George went outside, scanning the perimeter of the property, convinced that someone was playing a cruel prank. He expected to find a group of local boys hiding in the bushes or behind the barn. He found no one. The snow around the shed was undisturbed, yet the stones continued to batter the structure. Desperation drove George to seek help from the wider community. He realized that if he did not get outside verification, people would think he had lost his mind. He invited neighbors to come and see for themselves. At first, people were skeptical. They arrived expecting to find a family gripped by hysteria or a hoax orchestrated by the children. What they found silenced their doubts. Arthur Smart, a local skeptic, arrived at the farm determined to expose the trickery. He stood in the main room of the farmhouse, which the family had cautiously re-entered during the day. As he stood there, a stone the size of a hen's egg flew across the room and struck him. He could not determine the source. He watched as a wash basin rose from its stand and crashed to the floor. Smart left the farm shaken, his skepticism replaced by a deep unease. Word reached a man named Percy Woodcock, a well-known artist and an amateur investigator of the unexplained who was staying in Brockville. Woodcock was a man of education and intellect, not easily swayed by country superstitions. He heard the reports coming out of Clarendon and decided to travel to the Dagg farm to document the events firsthand. He arrived with a notebook and a critical eye, prepared to dismantle a fraud. Instead, he became the primary chronicler of one of the most intense hauntings in Canadian history. Woodcock arrived in the aftermath of the fires, just as the phenomenon was shifting into a new, more disturbing phase. The physical assaults were continuing, but now the entity was beginning to communicate. Woodcock spent days at the farm observing the family dynamics. He noted that Dinah seemed to be the epicenter. She was a quiet girl, often looking exhausted and frightened. When she was present, the activity spiked. Woodcock witnessed stones floating through the air, moving with a trajectory that defied physics. He saw them turn corners and slow down before hitting a target. He noted that while the stones often hit people, they rarely caused significant pain, as if the force was dampened at the last second. It was terrifying, but controlled. But the most chilling aspect for Woodcock was the sound that began to emanate from the empty air. It started as a low, guttural growl, distinct from any animal native to the region. The growling evolved into a voice. It was a gruff, masculine voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It did not originate from Dinah's mouth. Witnesses, including Woodcock, observed her closely while the voice spoke. Her lips did not move, and the sound often came from a corner of the room or from the ceiling. The voice was abusive and vulgar. It shouted obscenities at the family, mocked their fear, and made specific threats. It seemed to know things about the neighbors that no one else knew, revealing secrets that caused embarrassment and shock among the witnesses. This marked a turning point in the haunting. It was no longer just a force, it was a personality. Woodcock decided to engage the voice directly. He treated it not as a ghost, but as an intelligence that could be reasoned with or at least analyzed. He asked the entity what it was. The voice responded with a barrage of profanity, calling itself the devil. It claimed it was there to torment the family until they were driven out. Woodcock remained calm, recording the dialogue in his notes. He challenged the entity, asking it to perform specific tasks to prove its power. On one occasion, he asked the entity to retrieve a piece of paper he had marked and placed in a different location. Moments later, the paper drifted down from the ceiling, landing at his feet. The interaction between the artist and the invisible presence became a bizarre battle of wills. The sheer number of witnesses grew daily. People traveled from Ottawa and surrounding townships, clogging the road to the Dag farm. They crowded into the house, hoping to see a chair move or hear the voice. The farmhouse became a theater of the impossible. One witness, a local magistrate, watched as a pane of glass in the window shattered inward, yet the shards of glass remained on the sill, not scattering onto the floor. Another witness reported seeing a heavy dining table lift entirely off the ground while 3 men tried to hold it down. The force required to lift it against their resistance was immense. Through it all, the Dag family tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the strain was visible on their faces. George was losing weight, and Susan was perpetually on the verge of collapse. The voice began to show a strange duality. While it spent hours cursing and threatening, there were moments where it shifted tone completely. In one instance, while Woodcock was present, the voice began to sing. It did not sing a bawdy tavern song, but a hymn. The sound was high and clear, completely different from the gruff growl that usually terrorized the house. It sang "Nearer, My God, to Thee" with perfect pitch. The witnesses in the room were stunned into silence. The entity then engaged in a theological debate with Woodcock, discussing scripture and morality. This contradiction baffled the investigator. How could something that threw stones and started fires also sing hymns and discuss God? It added a layer of psychological complexity that made the case unique. Dinah, the young girl at the center, was often the target of the voice's duality. It would threaten to hurt her one moment, and then later it would claim to be her protector. Woodcock observed that the entity seemed possessive of the child. When Dinah was sent to a neighbor's house to sleep, hoping to give her some rest, the activity often ceased at the Dag farm, only to start up mildly at the neighbor's location. However, the most violent manifestations remained tied to the farmhouse itself. It was as if the energy required the combination of the location and the girl to reach its full potential. The psychological toll on Dinah was immense, yet she remained surprisingly resilient, often describing the presence as something she could feel before it acted. As December approached, the intensity of the haunting reached its peak. The fires had stopped, likely because the family had removed almost every flammable item they could spare, but the verbal harassment was constant. The entity began to claim that its time was short. It told Woodcock that it would be leaving soon. The reasons it gave were vague and conflicting. Sometimes it said it had completed its work, other times it claimed it was being forced out by a higher power. Woodcock pressed for a specific time and date. The voice gave a date in mid-November, but that passed with no change. Then it gave a date in early December. The unpredictability kept the family in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing if the quiet moments were the end or just a pause before a bigger storm. The physical phenomena became more aggressive toward visitors who mocked it. A man who laughed at the stories and dared the ghost to show itself was immediately struck in the face by a wet rag that materialized out of thin air. The rag was cold and smelled of swamp water. Another skeptic was hit by a stone that left a visible bruise on his arm. These targeted attacks served to validate the stories for the doubters. It was not just random energy, it was reactive. It listened. It understood context. It had a temper. The Dag Farm had effectively become a place where the laws of nature were suspended, and the community had to accept that there was something happening in their midst that their religion and their science could not explain. One particular afternoon, the farmhouse was packed with 17 witnesses. They included neighbors, family members, and curious travelers. The activity was relentless. Stones were thumping against the walls, voices were shouting from the corners, and objects were dancing on the tables. Woodcock realized the importance of this moment. He knew that once the haunting ended, people would claim it was mass hysteria or a tall tale. He decided to draft a legal document. It was a statement of facts, detailing exactly what they had seen and heard. He wrote down the descriptions of the fires, the stone throwing, and the voice. He read it aloud to the room, asking if everyone agreed that this was an accurate account of their experience. Every person in the room agreed. One by one, they signed the document. It was a remarkable moment in the history of paranormal investigation, a sworn affidavit signed by 17 credible witnesses attesting to the reality of the impossible. They were farmers, laborers, and respected community members, putting their names to a paper that declared they had seen chairs move and heard a disembodied voice. They knew they might be ridiculed, but the immediacy of the experience compelled them to sign. They wanted it on record that the Dag family was not lying. They wanted it known that they had stood in that cold farmhouse and witnessed things that should not be. Shortly after the signing of the statement, the activity began to wane. The voice spoke less frequently, its tone losing the aggressive edge that had defined it for weeks. The stones stopped falling. The furniture remained in place. The transition was not sudden, but a slow fading, like a storm blowing itself out. The entity, which had once dominated every hour of the day, became a sporadic nuisance, then a memory. By the deep winter of 1890, the Dag farmhouse was quiet. The family, traumatized and exhausted, tentatively began to move their lives back to normal. They repaired the broken windows and scrubbed the scorch marks from the floors. They brought the furniture back in, testing it to see if it would stay put. The departure of the entity left a vacuum of silence that was almost as unsettling as the noise. George Dag never fully recovered his sense of security. He had seen his home turned into a battleground against an invisible enemy. Susan Dag remained vigilant, watching the children for any sign that the presence had returned. Dinah, the focus of so much of the energy, grew up and eventually moved away, living a life that was largely quiet and unremarkable, a stark contrast to the chaos of her childhood. She rarely spoke of the events publicly in her later years, perhaps wishing to leave the darkness behind in Clarendon. Percy Woodcock left the farm with his notebook filled and his worldview shaken. He had come to expose a fraud and left as a believer in the unexplained. He championed the story not as a campfire tale, but as a documented case of spiritual interaction. He published his account detailing the conversations with the voice and the behavior of the thing. His report remains one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of a poltergeist outbreak from that era. He emphasized the intelligence of the entity, the way it played with them, and the distinct lack of fear it showed toward religious intervention. It was a puzzle he never solved, only observed. The Dag haunting, or the Dag poltergeist, as it came to be known in quieter circles, faded from national headlines but remained a potent legend in the Ottawa Valley. It was never solved. No trickwires were ever found, no ventriloquist was ever discovered. The sheer duration of the event, lasting several months, and the variety of phenomena from fire to sound to physical force made it difficult to dismiss as a simple prank. Pranks usually have a punchline or a profit motive. This had neither. It only brought destruction and terror to a poor farming family. The signed statement by the 17 witnesses sits in archives as a stubborn piece of evidence, a piece of paper that insists that for one winter in Quebec, the impossible became real. In the years that followed, the story was often retold in the region, passed down through generations of families who had been there or knew someone who had. The farmhouse eventually fell into disrepair, reclaimed by the harsh Canadian elements that had battered it during that long winter. But the core of the mystery remained. The entity had claimed to be a devil, then sang hymns. It had thrown stones to hurt, then claimed to protect the child. It was a mass of contradictions that mirrored the human mind, leading some to speculate on the psychic connection between Dinah and the energy. Was it an external spirit, or was it a manifestation of the stress and repressed energy of a young girl living in a hard environment? Is less than has hone. Zero hash is greater than. Modern researchers looking back at the Dag case point to the recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis theory, suggesting that Dinah was the unwitting agent of the chaos. The movement of objects, the fires, even the voice could be interpreted as a projection of adolescent turmoil. But this theory struggles to explain the shared auditory hallucinations, if that is what they were, or the physical bruises left on skeptics. The information provided by the voice regarding the secrets of the neighbors suggests an intelligence that had access to knowledge Dinah could not possibly have possessed. The mud incident, where sludge appeared from nowhere, and the spontaneous fires remain difficult to categorize under simple telekinesis. The legacy of the Dag haunting is one of unease. It sits uncomfortably in history, a verified event with no verified explanation. It is a story about the fragility of domestic safety, about how quickly a home can become a prison. The image of the family huddled in a shed while stones rain down from a clear sky is a potent reminder of their helplessness. They were besieged by an unseen force that operated by its own rules, a force that could not be shot, arrested, or reasoned with. The neutrality of the winter landscape, the white snow and the gray sky, provided a blank canvas for a terror that was vivid and loud. Today, the location of the farm is quiet. The intense energy that once boiled there has long since dissipated into the earth, but the records remain. The testimony of the local minister, the sketches by Woodcock, and the newspaper reports from the era form a mosaic of a haunting that was undeniably physical. It was not a ghost story of fleeting shadows and cold spots. It was a violent, noisy intrusion into reality. The Dag family survived it, but they did not conquer it. They simply endured until it chose to leave, and that lack of resolution is perhaps the most disturbing element of all. It implies that such things can happen, can tear a life apart, and then simply vanish, leaving the victims to sweep up the glass and wonder why. The incident serves as a historical bookmark in the study of Canadian folklore and paranormal research. It occurred in an era where superstition and nascent scientific inquiry often overlapped. The people involved were not seeking fame, they were seeking survival. The witnesses were not looking for ghosts, they were looking for answers. What they found was a void that looked back at them, a voice that knew their names, and a fire that started without a match. It remains a definitive, if often overlooked, example of the raw, chaotic nature of the poltergeist phenomenon, stripped of Gothic romance and left bare in the cold light of a Quebec winter. The unseen presence at Point Lookout. The coastline along the northern tip of Stradbroke Island remains a place where the landscape often dictates the mood of those who traverse it. In the early 1950s, the area around Point Lookout was far more isolated than it is today, consisting mostly of rugged cliffs, dense scrub, and a few scattered dwellings that braved the salt spray and the isolation. Local families and visiting fishermen often spoke of the peculiar atmosphere that settled over the headlands when the sea mist rolled in, obscuring the horizon and muffling the sound of the crashing waves. It was during this period that a series of documented reports began to emerge regarding a specific stretch of the coastal path, where multiple individuals claimed to have encountered a presence that defied standard explanation. These witnesses were not looking for ghost stories, they were workers, locals, and travelers who found themselves caught in moments of profound, inexplicable dread. The first significant account involved a local surveyor named Thomas who was tasked with mapping the terrain near the North Gorge. It was a clear afternoon with high visibility, yet as Thomas worked near the edge of the cliffs, he reported a sudden and localized drop in temperature that felt entirely out of step with the subtropical climate. He described a sensation of being watched from the thickets of banksia trees that lined the ridge. When he turned to look, he saw nothing but the swaying branches, but the feeling of a heavy, breathing presence just behind his shoulder became so overwhelming that he was forced to stop his work. He later told acquaintances that it wasn't just a feeling of being observed, but a physical weight in the air that made it difficult to move his limbs with their usual coordination. He left his equipment and returned to the main settlement, refusing to go back to that specific coordinate until the following morning. As the weeks progressed, other reports began to filter through the small community. A group of fishermen who had set up camp near the same area reported a night of broken sleep and mounting anxiety. They claimed that while the fire was burning bright, the shadows cast against the rocks didn't seem to move in sync with the flames. One man specifically noted that a shadow appeared to detach itself from the rock face and stand motionless at the edge of their campsite. There was no sound of footsteps on the dry leaves and no rustle of clothing, yet every man in the group felt an instinctive urge to remain silent and still. They didn't speak to each other until the sun rose, at which point they discovered that none of them had actually seen a physical person, yet all of them had perceived the exact same dark shape standing in the same spot for nearly 4 hours. The phenomenon wasn't limited to nighttime encounters. A woman named Elizabeth, who lived in one of the few permanent cottages on the island, reported an incident during a midday walk along the cliffs. She was familiar with the local wildlife and the sounds of the bush, but on this particular day, she noted that all bird calls and insect noises suddenly ceased. The silence was so absolute it felt unnatural. As she continued along the path, she saw a figure dressed in dark, heavy clothing standing near the cliff edge. Thinking it was a hiker in distress, she called out to offer assistance. The figure did not turn or acknowledge her. As she approached within 20 feet, the figure seemed to blur at the edges, losing its definition against the blue of the ocean behind it. Elizabeth stopped in her tracks when she realized that she could see the horizon line directly through the torso of the individual. Within seconds, the shape dissipated like smoke, and the sound of the wind and birds returned instantly, as if a vacuum had been lifted. These incidents began to create a sense of unease among the residents of Point Lookout, leading some to look into the history of the land. There were no records of recent disappearances or violent crimes in that specific area that could provide a logical basis for a haunting. Instead, the report suggested a recurring environmental glitch or a residual presence that had no interest in communicating with the living. The witnesses often described a sense of profound sadness or ancient indifference emanating from the phenomenon. It wasn't an aggressive haunting in the traditional sense, but rather a series of intrusions by something that didn't belong to the current timeline. Some suggested that the unique geological composition of the island, with its massive sand dunes and underground freshwater aquifers, might be responsible for some kind of natural recording of past events, though this was purely speculative. By the mid-1950s, the frequency of these reports increased. A delivery driver who frequently moved supplies to the lighthouse keepers reported a strange distortion of time while driving the coastal track. He claimed he left the settlement at his usual time, a trip that normally took 20 minutes. He remembered seeing a tall, dark figure standing in the middle of the road near the North Gorge. He braked hard, expecting a collision, but the figure was gone before his truck came to a complete stop. When he checked his watch, upon arriving at the lighthouse, nearly 2 hours had passed that he could not account for. He had no memory of anything other than the figure in the road and the sudden realization that the sun was much lower in the sky than it should have been. His fuel gauge also showed significantly less petrol than it should have for such a short journey, suggesting the vehicle had been idling or driving for a much longer duration. The local authorities were eventually notified of these recurring complaints, though there was little they could do. Without a crime or a missing person, the reports were filed away as curiosities or the result of heat exhaustion and isolation. However, the consistency of the descriptions provided by unrelated witnesses was difficult to ignore. Almost everyone mentioned the same dark, heavy clothing, the same blurring of edges, and the same paralyzing sense of dread that preceded the sighting. One constable who took a statement from a distraught camper noted that the witness seemed genuinely traumatized, not by what the figure did, but by the sheer wrongness of its presence. The camper had described the figure as having no face, just a smooth, dark surface where features should be, which seemed to absorb the light around it. In 1957, a visiting researcher from the mainland who was interested in coastal erosion spent several nights camping near the site of the most frequent sightings. He kept a meticulous log of weather conditions, tide levels, and any unusual occurrences. On his third night, his notes became increasingly erratic. He wrote about a rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground, followed by the sensation of the air becoming thick and difficult to breathe. He described seeing a series of lights moving across the water that did not correspond to any known shipping lanes or aircraft. Most tellingly, he recorded an experience where he felt his own perception of his surroundings begin to fracture. He wrote that the cliffs looked like they were made of glass, and he could see figures moving deep within the stone. He left the island the next day, leaving his research unfinished and refusing to discuss his notes in detail with anyone. The phenomenon at Point Lookout never reached a definitive conclusion or a dramatic climax. Instead, as the island became more developed and the population grew, the sightings began to taper off. The construction of newer roads and the clearing of some of the denser scrub may have altered the environment in a way that disrupted whatever conditions allowed these experiences to occur. By the 1970s, the stories had largely transitioned into local folklore, told to tourists around campfires, but rarely experienced with the same intensity as they were in the 1950s. The dense, oppressive atmosphere that once defined the North Gorge seemed to lift, or perhaps the modern world simply became too loud for the subtle distortions to be noticed. There are still those who walk the coastal paths today and claim to feel a sudden, inexplicable chill or a sense of being followed when no one else is around. Some photographers have reported strange artifacts in their digital images, dark blurs or shadows that don't align with the light sources, but these are easily dismissed as lens flares or technical errors. The original witnesses, many of whom have since passed away, remained steadfast in their accounts until the end. They didn't look for fame or money, they were simply people who encountered something that sat outside the boundaries of their everyday lives. They spoke of a point lookout that was older and more mysterious than the tourist destination it eventually became, a place where the veil between the known and the unknown was thin enough to let something through. One of the last well-documented accounts from the original era came from a retired schoolteacher who had lived on the island for 30 years. She described an evening in the late 1960s when she was sitting on her porch overlooking the sea. She watched as a dark figure walked out from the trees and proceeded to walk straight off the edge of the cliff. She ran to the edge, expecting to see a body on the rocks below, but the beach was empty and there was no sign of any disturbance in the water. There were no footprints in the sand, despite the tide being out. She noted that the most disturbing part wasn't the fall, but the way the figure moved. It didn't have the gait of a human, but rather moved with a mechanical, sliding motion that suggested it wasn't interacting with the gravity of the earth in a normal way. The mystery of the Point Lookout presence remains one of the most compelling examples of a localized, non-criminal paranormal event. It lacks the hallmarks of a staged hoax, as the witnesses were diverse and had nothing to gain from their stories. The lack of a clear backstory or a specific ghost with a name and a grievance makes it even more unsettling. It suggests that there are places in the world where the environment itself holds on to something we don't understand, or where time doesn't always flow in a straight line. The incidents were never linked to any cult activity, pranksters, or natural gas leaks that could cause hallucinations. They were simply moments of high-tension reality that left those involved forever changed in their perception of the world. The archival records of these events serve as a reminder that the world is often stranger than we give it credit for. While we look for logical explanations for every shadow and every chill, some things remain stubbornly outside the reach of science and reason. The people who stood on those cliffs in the 1950s and saw the faceless figures or felt the missing hours didn't care about theories. They only knew that they had touched something that felt fundamentally alien to the human experience. The landscape of Stradbroke Island continues to shift with the wind and the waves, but the memory of those encounters stays locked in the old reports and the stories told by those who remember the silence of the North Gorge. Even in the present day, researchers of the unexplained occasionally visit the island, hoping to catch a glimpse of what the early residents described. They bring sensors and cameras, looking for electromagnetic fluctuations or temperature spikes. While they sometimes find minor anomalies, nothing has ever matched the sheer scale and frequency of the mid-century sightings. It is as if the phenomenon had a lifespan of its own, or perhaps it only manifests when the conditions of human isolation and natural wildness are perfectly balanced. The modern amenities of the island may have acted as a form of grounding, pushing the unexplained back into the deeper, unreachable parts of the scrub. If you talk to the older generations who still reside in the area, they might point to a specific bend in the path or a particular rock formation where the air still feels a little too heavy. They won't tell you it is haunted by a person, but they might tell you that the land there has a memory that hasn't quite faded. They describe it as a ripple in water that takes a long time to settle. The feeling of being watched, the sudden silence of the birds, and the distortion of the light remain the primary indicators of this lingering residue. It is a haunting of place, not of person, where the horror comes from the realization that we are not always the primary inhabitants of the spaces we occupy. The legacy of these events is a quiet one. There are no plaques or markers indicating where the most famous sightings occurred. The island is content to let its secrets be buried under layers of sand and time. Yet, for those who have read the old testimonies or heard the first-hand accounts, the cliffs of Point Lookout will always carry a different weight. They represent a window into a period where the unexplained was a part of daily life for a few unfortunate witnesses, a time when the darkness at the edge of the campsite was something to be respected and feared. The faceless figure of the 1950s remains one of Australia's most enduring and least understood mysteries, a silent sentinel in the history of the island's rugged coast. As the sun sets over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the North Gorge, it is easy to see how the mind might play tricks. But for Thomas the surveyor, Elizabeth the resident, and the unnamed campers of the 1950s, it wasn't a trick. It was a physical, palpable reality that challenged their understanding of the natural world. They lived through a series of events that lacked a climax or a resolution, which in many ways is more disturbing than a story with an ending. The unresolved nature of the Point Lookout incidents ensures that the phenomenon remains a subject of quiet fascination, a reminder that some things in this world are meant to remain unexplained, existing in the periphery of our vision and the gaps in our records. The sheer volume of consistent data from that era suggests that whatever was happening at Point Lookout was a sustained event. It wasn't a one-off sighting or a localized legend. It was a decade of high-frequency anomalies that centered on a very specific geographical coordinate. Whether it was a rift in time, a sensory echo of a past event, or something entirely outside our current classification of the paranormal, its impact on the local culture was profound. It shaped the way people interacted with the landscape, instilling a sense of caution that persists in the way locals talk about the cliffs after dark. They don't talk about ghosts, they talk about the atmosphere, the weight, and the silence. Ultimately, the story of Point Lookout is a story about the limits of human perception. We are built to recognize patterns and find causes, but the witnesses on Stradbroke Island found neither. They were left with nothing but the memory of a shadow that didn't move right and a silence that felt like a scream. The events remain a significant part of the region's hidden history, a collection of moments where the ordinary world was interrupted by something vast and indifferent. The fact that it stopped, or at least faded from view, provides little comfort to those who know the details of the reports. It only leaves the question of when the conditions might become right for the presence to return to the cliffs once more. Today, the North Gorge is a popular spot for whale watching and scenic walks. Thousands of people pass through the area every year, most of them completely unaware of the history of the ground they walk on. They take photos of the same cliffs where Elizabeth saw a man turn to smoke and where Thomas felt a hand on his shoulder in the empty bush. The beauty of the location masks its eerie past, providing a veneer of safety and normalcy. But for the researcher who digs through the old archives, or the local who listens to the stories of their grandparents, the beauty of Point Lookout is always tempered by the knowledge of what might be standing just out of sight, waiting for the mist to roll in and the birds to go silent. The persistence of the Point Lookout reports, even in their diminished modern form, highlights the human need to document the strange. Even when there is no logical framework to support what is being seen, the act of reporting it becomes a way to process the trauma of the unexplained. The 1950s accounts were recorded with a clinical, matter-of-fact tone that makes them even more chilling. These weren't people prone to flights of fancy. They were practical, hard-working individuals who were confronted with something that simply should not have been there. Their testimonies stand as a collective witness to a decade of strangeness that defined a generation's relationship with the island. In the end, we are left with a series of questions that may never be answered. Was there a specific event in the distant past that triggered these manifestations? Is there something about the magnetic field of the island that creates sensory distortions? Or is it possible that certain places on Earth act as crossroads for things we cannot see? The Point Lookout presence remains an enigma, a shadow on the history of the Australian coast that refuses to be fully explained or forgotten. It serves as a stark reminder that even in a world mapped and explored, there are still pockets of the unknown that wait for a solitary walker to turn a corner and find themselves in a silence that shouldn't exist. The narrative of this coastal mystery is built on the quietest details, the sound of a footfall that isn't there, the sight of a horizon through a human shape, and the feeling of hours slipping away like water. These are the elements that stayed with the witnesses for the rest of their lives. They didn't tell stories of monsters, they told stories of a world that briefly stopped making sense. And as the waves continue to batter the rocks at the North Gorge, the island holds on to those moments, keeping them safe in the salt air and the shifting sands, a permanent part of the landscape that most will never see, but some will never forget. The final records from the late 1950s show a community that had grown weary of the strangeness. The reports became shorter, less detailed, as if the people had accepted the presence as just another hazard of the island, like the riptides or the summer storms. This normalization of the paranormal is perhaps the most interesting aspect of the case. It suggests that humans can adapt to almost anything, even the presence of a faceless figure standing on a cliff edge. The mystery didn't go away because it was solved. It went away because the world moved on, leaving the shadows of Point Lookout to find their own peace in the isolation of the coast. As we look back at the documented history of this period, the consistency across the decades remains the most striking feature. From the first surveyor in the early 50s to the retired teacher in the late 60s, the descriptions of the figure and the environmental changes remained virtually identical. This suggests a stable phenomenon rather than a series of disconnected hallucinations. It was a singular, recurring event that focused its energy on a specific patch of Earth. While we may never know what it was, the records provide a clear and unsettling picture of what it felt like to encounter it. Point Lookout remains a place of great natural beauty. But for those who know its history, that beauty will always be shadowed by the memory of the presence that once claimed the cliffs as its own. The story concludes not with a revelation, but with the same ambiguity that defined the events themselves. The presence at Point Lookout didn't leave a message or a warning. It didn't change the course of history or reveal great truths. It simply existed, a brief and terrifying intersection between the known and the unknown. Its legacy is found in the hushed tones of local stories and the yellowing pages of old reports, a reminder that the most disturbing things are often the ones that have no explanation and no purpose, existing simply because the world is far more complex than we can imagine. The island's topography, dominated by its massive sand dunes and the vastness of the Pacific, provides the perfect backdrop for such a lingering mystery. The sand itself is a shifting, ancient medium capable of burying secrets for centuries. Some believe that the very ground at Point Lookout acts as a vessel for these echoes, and that the events of the 1950s were simply a period where the vessel overflowed. Whether that is true or not, the impact on those who experienced it was very real. They walked away from those cliffs with a new understanding of the dark, a sense that the shadows aren't always empty, and that the silence of the bush isn't always peaceful. As the modern era continues to encroach upon the wild spaces of Australia, cases like the Point Lookout presence become even more significant. They represent the last vestiges of a time when the land was still capable of surprising us, of presenting us with something that we couldn't categorize or control. The faceless figure in the dark clothing remains a symbol of that era, a silent, blurring shape on the edge of the world, reminding us to be careful when we call out into the mist, because we might not like what doesn't answer back. The archival search for similar incidents along the coast has yielded few results that match the intensity of Point Lookout. Other islands have their legends, and other headlands have their ghost stories, but none possess the same clinical documentation of a recurring, non-criminal environmental disturbance. This uniqueness makes the case a cornerstone of Australian paranormal research, even if it remains out of the mainstream spotlight. It is a local mystery that has stayed local, preserved by the people who live there and the archives that keep their secrets. In closing, the events at Point Lookout during the 1950s stand as a testament to the power of place. The cliffs, the gorge, and the sea created a stage for something that defied the laws of the everyday. The witnesses were the unwilling audience, left to interpret a performance that had no script and no end. Their stories remain as a shadow on the landscape, a chilling reminder that some parts of the world are still governed by rules we haven't learned yet, and that the most frightening things are often the ones that stand perfectly still and say nothing at all. The final analysis of the witness accounts suggests that the dread was the most consistent symptom of the encounter. It was a biological response to an external stimulus that the human brain couldn't process. When the fishermen saw the shadow detach from the rock, or when Elizabeth saw the horizon through a man's chest, their bodies responded with a primal fear that bypassed logic. This fear is what links all the stories together, creating a narrative of a decade-long haunting that left a permanent mark on the psyche of a small island community. The presence may be gone, or it may simply be waiting for the world to become quiet enough for it to be seen again. Would you like me to investigate another lesser-known paranormal incident from the 20th century, perhaps focusing on the survival situations in the Canadian wilderness?